The moment Esther Garner saw the wheel splinter off her wagon and roll straight into the muddy ditch beside the trail, she knew the day had officially become the worst one of her entire 26 years on this earth. And yet, somehow, watching the stranger in the rain trying to lift it back up made it feel like the beginning of something she hadn't been expecting at all. It was the spring of 1873, deep in the Kansas plains, where the sky could turn on a person faster than a rattlesnake, and the red clay roads went soft as butter after even a mild rain. But this was not a mild rain. This was the kind of downpour that came in sideways off the flat prairie, the kind that soaked a person through their coat and their shirt, and down into their very bones before they even had time to curse it. Esther had been traveling the road from Dodge City, heading east toward the small settlement of Millhaven, a town barely large enough to earn a dot on most maps, where she had recently taken a position as the new schoolteacher following the sudden and tragic death of old Mr. Hollies, who had taught the children of Millhaven for nearly a decade before a stroke took him quietly one Sunday morning. Esther had packed everything she owned into that wagon. 2 trunks of books, a writing desk that had belonged to her late mother, a small cast-iron stove she'd purchased second-hand in Dodge City, her sewing basket, her winter coat, her summer dresses, jars of preserved peaches and pickled beets, and 3 layers of quilts she had sewn herself during the long Missouri winters before deciding that a new life was what she needed. She had loaded all of it herself because there was nobody left to help her. Her mother had been gone 4 years. Her father had died of a fever before Esther turned 15. Her one older brother had gone to California during the silver rush of the late 60s and had written exactly twice since then. She was, in the most practical sense of the word, entirely alone in the world. And so when the rear left wheel of her wagon struck a deep rut hidden beneath a sheet of brown rainwater, and the whole axle shuddered, and the spoke cracked, and the iron rim bent, and the wheel came loose and tumbled sideways into the ditch with a wet, horrible thud, Esther sat on the wagon seat in the rain and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed very carefully for a long moment. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in the middle of a problem did not solve the problem. It only made your face wet on top of your clothes already being wet. She climbed down from the seat carefully, her boots sinking into the mud, and she walked around to the back of the wagon and looked at the wheel lying in the ditch. The spoke was completely shattered. The rim had bent at an angle that no amount of hammering was going to fix without a proper smithy and a full replacement. She stood there in the rain with her hands on her hips looking at it, and she thought very calmly, well, this is a situation. She was approximately 4 miles outside of Millhaven by her best reckoning. She had passed no homestead in the last 6 miles. The road was empty in both directions. Her horse, a sturdy brown mare named Biscuit, stood patiently in her traces with her head slightly bowed against the rain, unbothered by the whole catastrophe in the philosophical way that horses sometimes were. Esther looked at Biscuit, and Biscuit looked back at her with large dark eyes that offered no solutions. Esther had just about made up her mind to unhitch Biscuit and ride her into Millhaven and send someone back with tools when she heard hoofbeats coming from the west. She straightened up and pushed the wet hair back from her forehead and squinted through the rain. The rider came around the gentle curve in the road at an easy lope, a big gray horse moving smooth and unhurried despite the weather, and the man on top of the horse sat so naturally in the saddle that he looked like he'd been born there. He wore a dark coat that was already black with rain and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. When he saw the wagon tilted at its odd angle in the road, he slowed his horse to a walk without being asked, and when he came close enough that Esther could see his face under the brim of the hat, she saw that he was younger than she'd expected, somewhere near 30, with a jaw that needed shaving and dark eyes that moved quickly and carefully over the whole scene, taking it in the way a man who'd spent a lot of time outdoors took things in, assessing without drama. He pulled the gray horse to a stop and looked down at her from the saddle. "Wheel came off," he said. "It was not a question. It did, Esther agreed. He swung down from the horse in one clean motion and tied the reins loosely to the side of the wagon and walked to the edge of the ditch and looked at the wheel. He crouched down and put his hands on it and examined the broken spoke and the bent rim with the same careful attention he'd given the whole scene when he rode up. "You got any tools in the wagon?" he asked, glancing back over his shoulder at her. "A hammer, some nails, a length of chain. I don't think any of it will be enough for this." "No," he agreed, standing up. "This rim is done for. Need a new wheel." "That's what I thought." He looked up the road toward Millhaven and then back west the way he'd come. Then he looked at her directly for the first time with his full attention, and Esther had the slightly unnerving experience of being looked at by someone who was genuinely paying attention and not pretending to. "I can ride ahead to Millhaven and have somebody send the smithy out," he said. "Or I can see about getting the wagon stable enough to move slow on the axle with the hub sitting on something. Either way, you're not going to want to stand out here in this." "I appreciate that," Esther said. "Though I don't seem to have much choice about the standing out here part at the moment." He almost smiled. It was a very restrained thing, that almost smile, just a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, but Esther noticed it. "Name's Eli Sawyer," he said, and he pulled off one wet glove and extended his hand. She shook it. His hand was large and calloused and completely certain of itself. "Esther Garner, I'm heading to Millhaven." "I know Millhaven," he said. "I've got a ranch about 8 miles south of it." He looked at the wagon again. "You mind if I take a look at what you're working with?" "The tools you've got, help yourself." He climbed up into the wagon bed without ceremony, and she listened to him moving things around in there, and she went back to the ditch and looked at the wheel again. The rain kept coming down in long gray sheets. She was so thoroughly soaked by now that the rain almost stopped being something she noticed. She had reached the stage of wetness that was simply a condition of existence. Esther was a practical woman. She had been practical her entire life because impracticality was a luxury that had never been available to her. She had gone to the normal school in Missouri on a partial scholarship she had earned herself. She had read every book she could get her hands on. She had taught herself enough Latin to read the original texts of several authors who interested her. She had learned to cook and sew and manage money and make decisions alone. She was not, she told herself firmly, the kind of woman who needed a man to come along in the rain and rescue her. But she was also not so stubborn and foolish as to refuse genuine help when it was offered. And there was something about the way Eli Sawyer had climbed into her wagon, without asking unnecessary questions, without making a fuss, without telling her not to worry or treating her like she was incapable of understanding the situation herself, that she found she did not object to. He came back down from the wagon with the chain and the hammer and crouched by the ditch and did something with the chain that she watched with interest but couldn't quite follow. He worked with the focused quietness of a man who was used to solving physical problems on his own, without talking through them or announcing what he was doing. After about 10 minutes of this, he straightened up and said, "I can carry the wheel. If I rig the chain to hold the axle off the ground on that side, we can walk the wagon slow into Millhaven. It'll take a while, but it'll get there." Esther looked at the wheel, which was large and heavy and iron-rimmed and sitting in a muddy ditch. "You can carry that." "For 4 miles, sure." She looked at him with a slightly more evaluating gaze than she'd used before. He was tall and broad in the shoulders, and he had the lean, hard look of someone who worked outdoors every day of his life, but the wheel was not small. "I can ride Biscuit ahead and send help," she offered. "Biscuit, my horse." He looked at the brown mare and back at her, and the almost smile came back. "I'll be all right," he said simply. And here is where the strange part began, the part that Esther would turn over in her mind many times in the weeks and months that followed, the part she would eventually tell to people with a slight embarrassed warmth and a shake of her head. Eli Sawyer rigged the chain to the axle with careful competence, climbed back down, picked up the heavy wagon wheel from the ditch, settled it on his shoulder, and stood there holding it in the rain while Esther tried 3 times to get Biscuit moving. The mare had decided, with the philosophical stubbornness of a horse who had been having a long day, that she was not going to move. She planted her feet in the mud and her head went low, and she simply would not budge. Esther tried everything she knew. She urged her forward, she clicked her tongue, she tried pulling her head up, she tried going back to her head to coax her. Biscuit stood like a brown statue in the rain. Esther was not going to admit defeat in front of a stranger, but she was also starting to wonder if divine forces were simply stacked against her today. In the course of trying to manage Biscuit, Esther stepped sideways to get a better angle on the mare's bridle, and in doing so she discovered something she hadn't known was there: a slight natural depression in the road's edge, screened by a growth of tall prairie grass that was bowing sideways in the rain. It created a kind of hollow, not large, but large enough that if you stood in it, you were half sheltered from the main driving force of the rain, and you had a clear, unobstructed view of the road ahead. Esther did not plan to stand in it for very long. She stepped into it simply because it was there, and because her feet were hurting from the mud suction, and she needed a moment to think about Biscuit. She looked up from the hollow at Eli Sawyer standing in the road holding the wagon wheel on his shoulder in the rain. He was looking at Biscuit. He had not noticed that Esther had moved sideways. The rain was loud and his hat was pulled low and his whole focus was on the horse, apparently waiting to see if the situation resolved itself. Esther meant to call out to him. She opened her mouth once to say something and then closed it again. She was not entirely sure why. He shifted the wheel slightly on his shoulder. It was visibly heavy, the way he was holding himself, the slight adjustment of his stance, and yet he held it with a steadiness that was almost absurd. He reached up with his free hand and tilted his hat back slightly, and the rain came full on his face, and he blinked against it and looked down the road toward Millhaven, and then back at Biscuit, with an expression that was patient and unhurried and slightly amused in a quiet way, as if he found the whole situation mildly entertaining rather than tedious or frustrating. He started to say something to the horse. Esther couldn't hear the words over the rain, but she could see his lips moving and she could see Biscuit's ears flicker toward him with interest. He kept talking to the horse in this low, steady way, still holding the wheel, still standing in the full force of the rain, his coat plastered to his shoulders, water running off the brim of his hat in a constant curtain. Esther stood in the hollow and watched him. She told herself she was simply waiting to see if his horse stalking would work on Biscuit. But that was only partly true. The fuller truth was that she was watching him the way you watched something that struck you unexpectedly as beautiful. The kind of thing you didn't want to interrupt because the interruption would end it. A man standing in a downpour holding a wagon wheel and talking patiently to a stubborn horse about getting moving, with no audience and no reason to perform for anyone, just doing the thing that needed doing with a kind of quiet dignity that made her chest do something she hadn't felt it do in a very long time. She stood there for a full hour. She knew it was an hour because she had a small silver watch her mother had left her, which she kept in her coat pocket, and she checked it twice while she stood in that hollow. She watched Eli Sawyer stand in the rain holding her broken wagon wheel, and she felt something she was going to have considerable difficulty explaining to herself later, and she did not call out to him for a full 60 minutes while she sorted through what exactly it was. Eventually, she cleared her throat loudly and stepped out of the hollow as if she had simply been standing 2 steps away from where she'd been before, and she said, "She can be difficult when she's tired. Let me try again." Eli looked over at her with no particular expression. "Thinks she's just cold," he said. "Doesn't want to move through the mud. Can't say I blame her." He walked, still holding the wheel, as easily as if it were a basket up to Biscuit's head, and stood there for a moment, and then he did something with his free hand. Just put it flat on the mare's nose very gently and held it there. And Biscuit blinked and shook her head once and then settled. And when Esther climbed back up to the wagon seat and took the reins and asked her forward, Biscuit walked. They went the 4 miles to Millhaven like that. Eli Sawyer on foot beside the wagon, carrying the wheel on his shoulder, his gray horse following behind on the loose reins with the philosophical patience of an animal who had seen this man do stranger things. Esther driving Biscuit at the pace of a slow walk, the wagon creaking and tilting slightly on its chained axle. The rain eventually lessened to a steady drizzle, and then, as they came in sight of the first buildings of Millhaven, to a light mist that turned the air silver. Millhaven in 1873 was a typical small Kansas settlement that had grown up around a water source and a crossroads, and had subsequently developed with the particular optimism of frontier towns everywhere. It had a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud in weather like this, lined with a general store, a livery stable, a small hotel that also served as the town's only eating establishment, a post office, a church that served as the schoolhouse on weekdays until a proper school building could be constructed, and a scattering of houses along the side streets in varying states of completion. It had a blacksmith, a large man named Jonas Briggs who had come west from Ohio a decade earlier, and whose hands were permanently black with soot, and whose disposition was unfailingly good-natured. And it had a doctor who was in fact a former veterinarian, who had expanded his practice to include humans on the grounds that the fundamentals were not so different. And it had a sheriff named Dale Oakes, who was about 55 years old, and moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who had decided a long time ago that most problems resolved themselves if you waited long enough. Esther had received a letter from the Millhaven School Board, which consisted of 3 men and 1 woman, a Mrs. Clara Finch, who was apparently the driving force behind most civic improvements in the town, describing the position and the small house that came with it, a 2-room frame house on the eastern edge of town that had belonged to Mr. Holly's and had been cleaned and prepared for the new teacher's arrival. The letter had described Millhaven with the cheerful overstatement of a place that wanted to attract settlers, calling it a growing and prosperous community with a bright future. Esther had read between those lines and expected something modest. What she found when they rolled in on that rainy spring afternoon was exactly modest, but it was clean, and there were people in the streets who stopped and watched the wagon arrive with the curiosity and warmth that small towns sometimes had for newcomers and sometimes did not, and Esther felt cautiously hopeful. Jonas Briggs came out of his smithy wiping his hands on a leather apron when he saw Eli carrying the wheel, and he looked at it with a professional frown and said he could have a new one ready in 2 days. He and Eli lifted the broken wheel together and examined the damage and discussed the dimensions and the ironwork needed, and Esther listened to this conversation and noticed that they knew each other, that Jonas clapped Eli on the arm and called him by name, and there was the easy familiarity of men who had dealings with each other regularly. Esther arranged to leave the wagon at the livery while the wheel was repaired, and she had Biscuit stabled and fed, and she paid for all of this with careful attention to what remained in her coin purse, which was not a great deal. The schoolteacher's pay in Millhaven was not extravagant. She had known that going in and had planned accordingly, but there was not much room in the plan for unexpected wagon repairs. Eli Sawyer helped her carry her 2 trunks of books, which were the heaviest things she owned, from the wagon to the small house on the east end of town, because she could not carry them herself, and because he simply picked them up without making a production of whether she wanted him to or not. She walked beside him through the muddy streets carrying her sewing basket and her mother's writing desk lamp under her arm, and they did not talk very much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. When the trunks were inside and he had set them down where she pointed, he stood in the doorway of her new house with his wet hat in his hands and the rain dripping from his coat onto her new floor, and he said, "You'll be all right here." It was a statement rather than a question, but it had the faint inflection of someone who actually wanted to know. "I will be," Esther said. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. I mean that sincerely. You didn't have to stop." "Well," he said, and he looked at the hat in his hands for a moment, "you had a wheel in a ditch and I had time. It wasn't complicated. She almost said something then. Almost said, "You stood in the rain for an hour holding that wheel and didn't say a word about it." But she didn't say it, for the same reason she hadn't called out to him from the hollow in the road, because some things she was discovering were better held quietly for a little while. "Will you ride safely?" she asked instead. "The roads will be worse going south." He looked slightly surprised by the question, as if it hadn't occurred to him that someone might ask. "I'll be fine," he said. "My horse knows the way." He put his hat back on and touched the brim of it with one finger in a gesture that was somehow both formal and easy, and he walked back out into the mist. And she stood in the doorway of her new house and watched him untie the gray horse from the post where he'd left it and swing up into the saddle and ride south down the main street and out of sight. Esther went inside and closed the door and stood in the middle of her new two-room house in her soaking wet clothes and looked at her 2 trunks of books and her mother's lamp and her sewing basket. And she thought about standing in that hollow in the road for a full hour watching a man she didn't know hold a wagon wheel in the rain. And she pressed her lips together and shook her head at herself and went to find dry clothes. She started teaching the following Monday. There were 14 children in the school, which in practice was the church's main room with the pews pushed back and 3 long plank tables set up for the students to work at. The ages ranged from 6 to 15, and the abilities ranged from children who could already read and do their sums to children who had never held a pencil before. Esther organized them into 3 groups by ability rather than age and set them to work. And by the end of the first week, she had a clear sense of who was struggling and who was being held back and what each of them needed. And she felt the satisfaction of work she was genuinely good at, which is one of the best feelings available to a person. Clara Finch came to introduce herself on Tuesday of that first week, knocking on the door of Esther's house in the evening with a covered dish of ham and potato stew, which Esther accepted with genuine gratitude. Clara was in her mid-40s, a compact and energetic woman with quick eyes and a directness that Esther found refreshing after a lifetime of people who talked around things. She sat down at Esther's table and drank the coffee Esther made and talked about the town with the frank authority of someone who had built most of it from scratch through sheer force of will. "You'll find people here are decent enough," Clara said. "They're set in their ways, some of them, but they're not unkind, and we desperately need a good teacher. Mr. Hollies was a fine man, but he was tired for the last 3 years of his life, and the children suffered for it." "How did you find me?" Esther asked. "Through the normal school in Jefferson City. I wrote to them asking if they had any graduates looking for a Western position, someone with real training rather than just someone's opinion that they could manage children." She looked at Esther with direct assessment. "They spoke very highly of you." "I'm glad," Esther said. "They mentioned you were unmarried." "I am." Clara nodded as if this were information that had various implications she was considering. "There's no shortage of unattached men in this area," she said. "If that's something you ever find you're interested in, I don't want to be presumptuous." "You're not presumptuous," Esther said. "I just arrived." Clara smiled at this. "Fair enough." After Clara left, Esther sat with her coffee and thought about what it would mean to build a life in this small, flat town on the Kansas plain. She had made a decision to come here because it was a fresh start, because the life she'd been living in Missouri had grown too small and too still, because she wanted to be of use somewhere. She had not come looking for anything else in particular. She had told herself that clearly and specifically before she packed her trunks. She thought, briefly, about Eli Sawyer, and then she thought about something else. She saw him again on the Saturday of her second week in Millhaven. She had gone to the general store, a place run by a man named Harold Pierce who was pleasant, but who overcharged for everything in the quiet, confident way of someone who knew. He had the only store for miles, to buy flour and salt and a bottle of ink for her pens. She was standing at the counter discussing the price of ink, which she felt was considerably higher than it ought to be, when the door of the store opened and Eli Sawyer came in. He was less wet this time. He was wearing a clean shirt and his coat was dry and his hat was in better shape. He looked like a different version of the same man, which was to say, he looked like the version who hadn't spent an hour in a rainstorm. He saw her immediately and stopped in the doorway for just a moment before he came the rest of the way in. "Miss Garner," he said. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. "You look considerably drier than the last time I saw you. Most days are drier than that one." Harold Pierce looked between them with the alert curiosity of a shopkeeper who functioned as the primary news-gathering mechanism of a small town. Esther paid for her flour and salt and the ink, including the overpriced portion, without further argument since she had made her point, and there was no changing the price, and she gathered her purchases in the canvas bag she'd brought and turned to go. Eli was looking at a display of rope near the door. She almost just said goodbye and left. She was halfway to the door when she stopped and turned back, because she was a practical woman and practical women did not let excessive caution get in the way of things they actually wanted to do. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. He looked over. "I never thanked you properly for what you did. Would you like to have dinner? I'm cooking Sunday evening and it would only be decent to offer you a meal for carrying that wheel 4 miles in the rain." She kept her voice entirely ordinary and matter-of-fact, as if inviting a person to dinner was something she did constantly and meant nothing particular by. He looked at her for a moment, those dark, careful eyes doing their assessing thing. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "What time?" "6 o'clock, she said. "The small house on the east end of Main Street, the one with the blue shutters." "I'll be there," he said. She walked out of the general store and down the muddy street to her house, and she did not permit herself to think too hard about any of it until she was inside with the door shut. He came at 6 o'clock exactly. She had made a roast chicken with the last of her preserved potatoes and a dried apple pie, which had stretched her budget for the week, but which she had decided was worth it on the grounds that you only had one chance to make a proper first impression as a host. He brought a bottle of wine, which surprised her, not cheap whiskey or nothing, which she might have expected, but an actual bottle of California wine that he set on her table without comment, as if it were simply the obvious and correct thing to bring. They ate at the small table in her front room, which also served as her sitting room and her work room, and the conversation surprised her. She had half expected it to be the polite, somewhat stiff exchange of two people who didn't know each other very well trying to get through an evening, without running out of things to say. Instead, it was easy and surprising in turns, the way good conversation sometimes was with people you'd misjudged based on their surface. He had grown up in Texas, he told her, on a cattle ranch his father had built from nothing after coming west from Tennessee. He had driven cattle on the Kishom Trail twice in his late teens, which had been hard work that he did not romanticize, dusty and exhausting and occasionally dangerous, and not at all the adventure it was made out to be in the dime novels that were appearing in eastern cities with increasing ridiculousness. He had come to Kansas 4 years ago and bought his land with money he'd saved over the better part of a decade of working for other men, and he had been building his ranch since then, slowly and deliberately. "Do you have anyone helping you?" Esther asked. "At the ranch. I've got 2 hands who live in the bunkhouse. Good men. One of them is named Will, been with me 3 years. The other is new this season. And I've got a neighbor, an older man named Henry Caulfield, who's been ranching about 5 miles north of me for 15 years. He knows this country the way I'm still learning it." He paused. "You learn the land slow out here. It doesn't rush for you." "No," Esther said, thinking of the flat, enormous sky she'd been looking at for 2 weeks. "I don't imagine it does." "What made you want to come out here?" he asked. He asked it with genuine curiosity rather than the vaguely suspicious way that some people in small towns asked newcomers that question, as if wanting to know what they were running from. Esther considered being circumspect and then decided against it. "I needed somewhere to be needed," she said. "Missouri was. I had a position there teaching in a school that already had 3 teachers. Good teachers. They didn't need me particularly." And I had nothing holding me there anymore since my family is gone. And when the offer came from Millhaven, I thought it was exactly the kind of place that needed exactly what I have to offer. Small and serious about its future and willing to invest in its children. He nodded slowly. That's a clear-headed way of thinking about it. I tend toward clear-headedness, Esther said, which made him smile, a full smile this time, not the almost version, and it changed his face considerably. There was warmth in it. Is that always comfortable? He asked. She tilted her head slightly at the question. No, she admitted, not always. They stayed at the table long after the chicken and the potatoes were gone, finishing the bottle of California wine in 2 slow glasses apiece, talking about books. He had read more than she'd expected, including a battered copy of Dickens and a collection of essays by Emerson that he'd apparently carried in his saddlebag across the state, and about the politics of the Kansas frontier, which were complicated and often unjust in ways that Esther had opinions about and was not shy in expressing. She talked about the treatment of the native peoples of the plains, the systematic destruction of ways of life that had been established for generations, the broken treaties, the forced relocations, and she watched his face as she did it to see what she'd get back. What she got back was, "You're right, it's wrong. And most of the men making the decisions about it have never met an actual Comanche or Kiowa person in their lives. They're deciding the fate of people they think of as abstractions." "You've met them," she said. It was not a question. Traded with a Kiowa band 2 years ago when they came through this part of the state. Peaceable people, at least in that meeting. Had no reason to be otherwise. We had something they needed and they had something I needed, and we treated each other like people, which seems to me the minimum. He turned his wineglass in his hands. It's not always that simple, I know, but it's at least that simple when people let it be. She went asleep that night thinking that she had seriously underestimated Eli Sawyer, which was a satisfying thing to have gotten wrong. He came to dinner the following Sunday as well, though neither of them had explicitly arranged it. He appeared at her door at 6 o'clock with a wrapped package of smoked venison, and she had already set 2 places at the table, and neither of them commented on the fact that they'd both simply assumed the other would be there. The second dinner was even easier than the first. She had learned some of the names and stories of the people she was teaching. The alderman children, 4 of them, who came from a homestead 3 miles east and arrived every morning with their lunches packed in a tin pail by their mother, and who were uniformly curious and hardworking. Young Danny Pratt, who was 13 and could barely read, but who was the most determined student she'd ever seen, practicing his letters every evening until they were right. Little Marguerite Oakes, the sheriff's granddaughter, who was 6 and had already memorized more of the Times tables than most 9-year-olds Esther had ever taught. She talked about them with the genuine delight of someone who loved her work, and Eli listened in the way that good listeners did, which was to say he actually tracked the stories and asked questions that showed he'd been paying attention. He told her about a dispute he'd had with a neighbor to the south, a man named Garrett Pyle, who had the habit of letting his cattle drift across property lines, and who had most recently done it during the early spring when Eli's grass was needed for his own stock. It was the kind of low-level tension that permeated ranch country in Kansas in those years, when land ownership was recent enough that the lines still felt provisional to some people. He spoke about it without a great deal of heat, more with the weariness of a man who would rather focus his energy on building things than defending them. "Did it get resolved?" Esther asked. "For now. I had a conversation with Pyle that made the situation clear. He understood." The way he said it evenly, without elaboration, made Esther think that the conversation with Pyle had probably been unambiguous in a way she was glad she hadn't witnessed. By the 3rd Sunday, she had begun to understand what was happening. And on the 4th Sunday, when he arrived at her door and she opened it, and the plain, warm fact of being glad to see him came over her so naturally and so powerfully that she felt it in her whole body, she stopped pretending she didn't know what this was. They went for a walk that evening instead of staying inside, because the weather had turned warm and the Kansas sky at sunset was doing one of the extraordinary things it sometimes did, turning every shade of pink and gold and purple across the enormous flat horizon. And they walked south from the edge of town, along the road Eli rode home on every Sunday. And they talked, and then they were quiet for a while, and the quiet was so comfortable and natural that Esther thought she could not remember the last time silence with another person had felt like that. They stopped at the top of a small rise, small by any other landscape standards, but noticeable in the flatness of the plains, and looked at the sunset, and Eli said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "That day on the road when the wheel came off," he paused. "After a while I couldn't see you. I thought you'd gone to the other side of the wagon." Esther looked at the sunset, a beat of silence. "I'd stepped off the road a little way," she said, "into a hollow in the grass." "I thought so," he said. Not accusatory, not teasing, just quiet. "I was starting to wonder if I'd lost you entirely." "You hadn't," she said. Another pause. The last of the pink was fading to deep purple at the horizon's edge. "Were you watching me?" he asked. Esther Garner was a woman who valued honesty with a conviction that had sometimes cost her, and so she did not look away from the horizon, but she did not pretend either. "I was," she said, "for about an hour, I think." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable silence of before. It was charged and still and careful. "And," he said. She turned to look at him then, and he was already looking at her, and the last light of the sunset was on his face, and his dark eyes were steady and waiting. "And I thought," she said carefully, "that I was watching something worth watching." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said very low, "Miss Garner." "Esther," she said, "you've had dinner at my table 4 Sundays running. I think we're past Miss Garner." He reached out, and his hand found hers in the dimming light, just took it quietly and without ceremony, the way he did everything, without performance, without announcement, simply and certainly. "Esther," he said. They stood on that small rise in the Kansas dark, holding hands while the last color left the sky. And Esther thought about the first time she'd seen him ride around that curve in the road in the rain. And she thought about the hour she'd spent in the hollow watching him hold that wheel with the steady patience of a man who had decided that a thing needed doing. And so he was going to do it, no matter how long or how wet or how heavy. And she thought that she had known even then, in some chamber of herself that was not quite rational and not quite conscious, that this was going to matter. He walked her back to her house and said good night at the door, and when he rode south into the dark on his gray horse, she stood in the doorway until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats any more. The spring deepened into summer, and the summer was fierce and dry on the Kansas plain in 1873, the way Kansas summers often were. The schoolroom was sweltering by July, and Esther moved the lessons outside under the single large cottonwood that stood behind the church. And the children sprawled in the shade doing their arithmetic and their reading, while the heat shimmered off the flat land all around them. Esther drank enormous quantities of water and wore her lightest dress, and was grateful every evening when the heat broke slightly and the dry wind came off the prairie. She and Eli had fallen into a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. Sundays were their established day, but as the weeks went on they found other reasons and other times. He came to town midweek sometimes on ranch business supplies to collect, dealings with Jonas at the smithy, the occasional conversation with Sheriff Oakes, and when he did he usually stopped by in the early evening if she wasn't still at the schoolhouse. She rode Biscuit out to his ranch twice that summer when the school was not in session, once to see the place, and once because he had asked her to and she had wanted to. His ranch was 8 miles south of town down a road that was rough in spring and baked hard in summer, and it sat in a slight depression of the land where a creek ran reliable enough to support good grass and trees along its banks. The house was not large, 2 rooms proper, with a sleeping loft, built solid from lumber he'd had hauled in from Dodge City and from cedar logs he'd cut himself. But it was well made, the kind of structure built by someone who understood that doing it right the first time was easier than fixing it later. He had a barn that was newer than the house and in better shape, which made Esther smile because it told her something true about him. He had 63 head of cattle and was building toward 100. He had 2 horses besides the gray, a younger roan he was training, and a sturdy work horse he used for the heavier pulling. He had a kitchen garden that was badly kept, clearly not his strong suit, which she noted without comment. She walked around the place that first visit with the careful attention she gave everything, and she asked questions and he answered them without embellishment, and at the end of the walk she said, "You've built something real here." He looked at the land around the house and the barn and the creek and the cattle grazing in the far pasture. "Working on it," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You've built something real. I want you to know I see that." He looked at her then the way he sometimes looked at her, that full, unhurried attention, and he said, "That means something coming from you." "Why particularly from me?" "Because you don't say things you don't mean," he said. "I noticed that early on." She filed that away in the growing inventory of things she found she valued about Eli Sawyer. They argued for the first time in August, and the argument was neither small nor manufactured. It was real and it mattered. Esther had heard through Clara Finch, who heard it through the particular information network of a small town, that Garrett Pyle, the neighbor who'd had the cattle drifting dispute with Eli in the spring, had made a formal complaint to the county recorder claiming that Eli's eastern fence line was placed incorrectly, that it crossed onto land Pyle maintained should be his. The county recorder was sending a surveyor. Esther brought this up on a Wednesday evening when Eli came by in a matter-of-fact way because she thought he might not have heard and should know. He had heard, and he was not handling it with the even temper he usually had. "Pyle is a liar," he said flatly, standing in the middle of her front room with his hat in his hands. "That fence is exactly where it should be. I had it surveyed when I put it in. Then the new survey will show the same thing. Or Pyle will pay someone to show otherwise. He's got money and he's got friends in the county seat. I've been watching him pressure smaller homesteaders for 3 years. He got the alderman family to give up 12 acres last year by making the process so expensive and exhausting that they couldn't fight him anymore." Esther was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Alderman mentioned it when she came to talk to me about her children. She was angry about it, still is. As she should be." He turned away and looked out the window at the evening street. "This is how it goes for people who don't have the legal resources to protect themselves. The process itself is the weapon." "I agree with you," she said, "but I want to ask you something and I need you to hear it without getting defensive." He turned back. "Is there anything about the placement of your fence that could be even slightly ambiguous?" "Not wrong, I believe you that it's right, but anything that Pyle could point to and say, well, it could be read this way." He was very still for a moment. Then slowly, "The southwest corner has a marker that was placed by the county before I bought the land, and the marker's positioning has a half-degree discrepancy from the deed description. It's nothing, it shouldn't matter." "But it could be made to matter," Esther said quietly. "Yes. Then you need to talk to a land lawyer in Dodge City before the surveyor comes, not after." He looked at her. "Lawyers cost money I could spend on cattle. And losing 12 acres to Garrett Pyle costs you money and land and the precedent that he can do it again." She met his gaze steadily. "I know I don't have a stake in this, and I know you didn't ask for my opinion." "I did not ask for it either," he said after a moment. She exhaled. "Good." He rode to Dodge City the following week and came back with a letter from a land lawyer that specified clearly the legal standing of his survey and the deed language. And when the county surveyor came out 3 weeks later, he found Eli's fence exactly where the deed said it should be, and Garrett Pyle's complaint was dismissed. Eli mentioned this to Esther on the following Sunday as if it were a minor piece of news. She received it the same way. But when he looked at her across the table, there was something in his face that was not minor at all. "You were right," he said, "about the lawyer." "I know," she said pleasantly. He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, that she hadn't heard him produce before. It was a good laugh. She liked it extremely. In September, the weather began to ease and the schoolroom moved back indoors, and the school's enrollment grew by 3 when the Hartfield family arrived in Millhaven from Ohio, and their children were enrolled on a Thursday morning. Esther stood at the front of the schoolroom and looked at her 17 students, and felt a satisfaction that was almost painful in its intensity. The satisfaction of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. That same September, on a cool evening with the first real hint of autumn in the air, Eli Sawyer came to her door on a Wednesday evening, not his usual day, and stood on her porch with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something uncertain and careful layered over his usual steadiness. "Is something wrong?" she asked immediately. "No," he said. "Nothing's wrong. I needed to see you, and it wasn't Sunday and I couldn't wait." She stepped back from the door and he came in, and she poured them each a cup of coffee and they sat down, and he was quiet for longer than usual, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "What is it?" she said finally. He looked at her. "I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I'm not a man who talks around things, so I'm just going to say it." "All right," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said, plain and direct, the way he did everything. "I have been for a while now, since before I could put a name to it. And I'm not asking you for anything right this minute. I'm not proposing something you haven't thought about or making demands. I just needed you to know, because going around with it unsaid was starting to feel dishonest, and I don't want to be dishonest with you." The room was very quiet. The evening wind moved softly outside. Esther Garner looked at Eli Sawyer across the table, and the thing she had been carrying carefully and quietly since she'd watched him stand in the rain holding her wagon wheel rose in her chest and became simply, peacefully, impossible to keep quiet any longer. "I know," she said, and her voice was low and certain. "I know you are, and I love you too, Eli. I have been for a while." He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the rise above the road in the sunset light, quietly and with complete certainty. "All right," he said, and he sounded like a man who had just put down something he'd been carrying a long way. "All right then." She laughed softly at that, and he smiled his full, warm smile, and they sat at her small table in her 2-room schoolteacher's house on the east end of Millhaven, Kansas, and looked at each other in the candlelight. And the world outside the window was wide and dark, and full of all the things that were still ahead of them. October came with a blue sharpness to the air that Esther loved. The children wore coats to school, and the lessons moved to arithmetic and geography with increased enthusiasm, because the warmer months' restlessness had burned off with the heat. Danny Pratt was reading, now properly reading, sounding out difficult words and only occasionally asking for help. And when Esther saw him doing it with the focused, triumphant concentration of someone who had worked very hard for a very long time for something that other people found easy, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove she'd finally gotten set up in the schoolroom corner. She and Eli were together now in the clear, acknowledged sense, and Millhaven had opinions about this, which was inevitable and expected. The opinions ranged from warm approval. Clara Finch was openly delighted. In the brisk, unsentimental way, she had to mild disapproval from 1 or 2 of the more conservative families who felt the schoolteacher ought to be setting a more decorous example. Sheriff Oakes looked at both of them with the slow, bemused consideration he brought to everything, and told Eli that Miss Garner was the sharpest person who'd come to Millhaven in 5 years, and he'd be a fool to let her get away. Eli had related this to Esther with a slight awkwardness that she found endearing, and she had said, "The sheriff is right," which had made the awkwardness shift to something warmer. They were not reckless about it. They were in 1873 Kansas, and they were aware of the conventions of the world they lived in, and they respected the practical reality of those conventions while not being governed by them entirely. He was at her house in the evenings. He helped her when her small house needed work, and it needed quite a bit of work, being an older structure that Mr. Hollies had not kept up in his final years, and they were seen together in town and on the road and at the church on Sunday mornings, and the town adjusted to this gradually, the way small towns did, filing it under understood facts about the people in it. In November, he asked her to marry him. He did it on the rise above the road where they'd held hands for the first time, on a cold, clear afternoon with the sky an enormous sheet of blue above the flat golden land. And he did it in the way he did things, directly and honestly, without theatrical staging or excessive speech, just, "Esther, will you marry me?" She looked at the horizon and then at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Obviously. I moved to Kansas with 2 trunks of books and a broken wagon wheel, and I found you holding the wheel in the rain," she said. It was obvious. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know meant he was moved but not going to say too many things about it. Then he pulled her toward him and kissed her for the first time, there on the rise in the cold November wind, and it was the best first kiss she could have imagined, certain and warm, and absolutely without hesitation. They were married in the Millhaven church on a Saturday in December of 1873, with snow on the ground and a weak winter sun coming through the windows. Clara Finch organized the wedding supper. The alderman children brought flowers that were technically dried weeds from the prairie, but had been arranged with sincere effort. Jonas Briggs made a set of iron candle holders as a wedding gift that were unexpectedly beautiful, the ironwork done with a delicacy that surprised everyone who knew Jonas as a large, soot-covered man who fixed wagon wheels. Sheriff Oak stood at the back of the church with his hands folded and looked quietly satisfied. Esther wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, and she had done her hair up with her mother's silver pins, and she stood at the front of the church in the winter light and said her vows to Eli Sawyer with the clear, steady voice of a woman who was absolutely certain of what she was doing. He wore a clean suit that he'd had made in Dodge City. She found out later that he'd ridden there specifically to have it made, which he had mentioned to no one, and he stood beside her in it with the particular straight-backed dignity of a man wearing formal clothes with complete self-consciousness. And when he said his vows, he looked at her the whole time with that full, unhurried attention of his, and she felt it the whole way through her like warm light. After the ceremony, there was dancing in the church hall, fiddle music from 2 of the ranch hands who turned out to have a gift for it, and food enough to feed the whole town. And Esther danced with her new husband on the church hall floor while the snow fell outside the windows, and she laughed more than she had laughed in years. And Eli held her with the ease and certainty he brought to everything, and the night went long and warm and bright. They moved into Eli's ranch house in January, which meant Esther was now riding Biscuit 8 miles into Millhaven every weekday morning and 8 miles back in the evening, which was not a small thing in a Kansas winter. This was a practical issue she had considered before the wedding and which she had a clear plan for. She rode when the weather allowed, and when it didn't she stayed in the small house on the east end of town, which the school board agreed to keep available to her for that purpose. It was a sensible arrangement, and it worked because she and the school board, and particularly Clara, had negotiated it sensibly before the wedding rather than after. Eli thought about this and then suggested an alternative. In the winter months, they would both stay at the ranch house on the days when weather prevented the school from meeting, which in a hard Kansas winter was sometimes several days in a row, and on the clear days she would ride in. He would hire a hand who could make the ride with her in the mornings and wait or find work in town during the day and ride back with her in the evenings, so she was not riding alone on the winter roads. The hand he hired for this purpose was a young man of 22 named Thomas Webb, who was quiet and reliable, and who spent his days in Millhaven helping Jonas at the smithy in exchange for a small additional wage from Jonas, so the arrangement suited everyone. Thomas rode with Esther every school day that winter with the serene dedication of someone who had been assigned a task and was going to do it well, and he never talked more than she wanted him to talk and always knew when she was thinking and needed quiet, which she appreciated. Winter gave way to another spring, and the spring of 1874 brought a warmth and a softness to the Kansas land that Esther found she loved in a new way. In the way you loved a landscape that had become yours, that you had survived the cold alongside, and that was now showing you what it was when it was well. The creek behind the ranch house ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the new grass came up green and astonishing in the pastures, and Eli's cattle, now up to 81 head, moved through it with placid contentment. Esther found out she was pregnant in April. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Eli, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to hold it herself for a little while first, to feel the full weight and meaning of it alone before it became shared. On the 3rd day she told him after supper, sitting at the table in the ranch house with the spring evening coming through the window. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand the way he always did, and his voice when he spoke was slightly rough in a way she had never heard before. "Are you well?" he asked. "You're feeling all right." "I'm feeling well," she said. "A little tired, but well." He looked at her hand in his and then at her face, and his expression was not quite what she'd expected. It was not simple joy, though joy was there. It was something bigger and more serious, something that understood all the ways this changed things and was meeting that understanding with the same steadiness he brought to everything, but with more of himself showing through the steadiness than she usually got to see. "Esther," he said, very quietly. "I know," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which he had done exactly once before, on their wedding night, and which she understood was a gesture he reserved for moments that were too large for ordinary expression. She taught through the school year until June, by which point she was showing enough that the school board, specifically, the 2 more conservative members, began to make uncomfortable noises about the propriety of a visibly pregnant woman teaching children. Clara Finch shut this conversation down with a precision and ferocity that Esther heard about second-hand from 3 different people, and that made her feel a warm and powerful gratitude for Clara Finch. She stopped teaching in late June, not because she was forced to, but because the pregnancy had become physically exhausting, and she had enough clear-headedness to know when rest was the right choice. She arranged for Clara's eldest daughter, a capable young woman named Ruth who had completed 2 years at a teacher's college in Kansas City before coming home to help with her mother's household, to take over the class for the summer and into the fall. She spent the last months of the pregnancy at the ranch house, which was both easier and more complicated than she'd expected. She was not, by nature, a person who rested easily. She reorganized Eli's kitchen garden with such thoroughness and competence that by August it was producing more than either of them could eat, and she spent the hot afternoons putting up preserves with a focus and energy that the ranch hands observed with respectful wariness. She read everything she'd brought in her trunks that she hadn't gotten around to yet. She wrote long letters to her brother in California, who had finally, after years of intermittent silence, begun writing back with some regularity, apparently because he had settled down with a wife of his own and felt the pull of family more keenly now. She worried sometimes in the nights when the heat was bad or the baby was pressing on her in uncomfortable ways. She worried about the birth, which was a reasonable thing to worry about. She worried about Eli's safety on the range, which was a thing she didn't tell him she worried about because she understood that worrying about it out loud wouldn't change it and would only add weight to his days. She worried about whether she was going to be good at this new thing of being a mother, in the way she was good at teaching, which was to say deeply and seriously and with her whole self committed to it. Eli knew she worried. He knew it without being told because he paid attention to her with the same carefulness he paid to everything, and he didn't try to argue her out of the worry or tell her it was unnecessary. He simply made sure she was not alone in it. He came home earlier in the evenings than he had before. He drove her in the wagon to town once a week so she could see Clara and Mrs. Alderman, and the other women she'd become friends with, which was both practically useful and emotionally important in ways he understood without requiring explanation. He fixed a rocking chair on the porch so she could sit outside in the evenings in the cooling air. He learned to make coffee the way she liked it, which was strong, which was different from how he'd been making it for himself all his life. Their son was born in October of 1874, attended by the doctor veterinarian, whose name was Percival Gantz and whose hands were steady, and whose confidence was genuine, and whose success rate for both humans and animals was high. Esther was in labor for most of a long day, and at the end of it she was exhausted in a way she had no previous reference point for, and the child who was placed in her arms was red-faced and vigorous, and complained loudly about the transition from one world to the next, which Esther found immediately and deeply reassuring. "A boy," Dr. Gantz said, with the satisfaction of someone who had just done good work. Eli was in the room he had refused with quiet implacability to be anywhere else, and when he held his son for the first time, Esther watched his face and saw the thing she had glimpsed when she told him she was pregnant, the full weight of feeling that he didn't usually let show, this time without any restraint at all. "Hello," he said to the baby, very low, just that, hello. As if he were meeting someone he'd been expecting, and was very glad was finally here. They named him Henry James Sawyer Henry for Eli's old neighbor Henry Caulfield, who had helped Eli through his first hard years on the Kansas land, and who had died of a heart ailment the previous winter, and James for no particular person, but because it was a solid name, and they both liked it. Henry was a good baby in the particular way that some babies were not easy exactly, because no baby was easy, but clear in his communications, and responsive to comfort and visibly interested in the world in a way that Esther found charming even at 3 in the morning. He looked like Eli from the first weeks, the same dark eyes and the same quality of paying attention to things, though in a baby this looked more like an expression of mild but intense philosophical consideration. Esther went back to teaching in January of 1875. Ruth Finch had kept the school admirably in her absence. Ruth was genuinely gifted with children, it turned out, with a warmth and firmness that balanced well, and Esther came back to a class that was orderly and progressing and happy to have her. She and Ruth taught together that spring, which worked well for both of them and for the school. Henry came with her to school on most days, sleeping in a basket behind Esther's desk in the morning, and entertaining the older children at lunch with his gradually expanding repertoire of expressions and sounds. The children adored him without reservation, particularly the younger ones, who treated him with the proprietary enthusiasm of people who felt they had some claim on something. Danny Pratt, who was now 15 and reading at a level that regularly surprised people, took it upon himself to keep the baby's basket from being accidentally knocked by passing feet, with a vigilance that Esther found touching. The years that followed were full years. Not without difficulty. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was brutal, cold that broke records and snow that kept the ranch effectively isolated for 3 weeks in February, during which time Eli and Thomas and the ranch's other hand, a young man named George, fought to keep the cattle alive and the horses fed and the well from freezing, and Esther kept the house warm and the food going and Henry healthy and occupied, which was its own considerable battle. They came out the other side of that winter leaner and more tired than they'd gone in, but intact. The cattle herd grew to 120 by 1877. Eli hired a third permanent hand and built a bigger bunkhouse. He put a second room on the main house in the spring of that year, a proper bedroom for Henry, who was nearly 3 by then, and who had begun to communicate his opinions about the world with considerable energy and specificity. He had Eli's watchfulness and Esther's vocabulary, and a combination of both their stubbornness that expressed itself as a cheerful, implacable determination to understand everything. Esther was expecting their second child by that summer. She was 30 years old and Eli was 34, and they had built together in 4 years something real and solid. The ranch, the school, the life in Millhaven that she had walked into on a rainy spring afternoon in 1873 with everything she owned in a wagon that then immediately lost a wheel. She thought about that sometimes. How close she'd come to a different road. How a different direction from Dodge City, or a different day's departure, or a wheel that held together through the rut would have meant no hollow in the grass, and no hour of watching a stranger in the rain, and no Sunday dinners, and no rise above the road, and no wedding in the December church, and no Henry in his basket behind her desk looking at the world with dark, wondering eyes. It made her feel the texture of luck in a way that humbled her. Her second child was born in January of 1878, a girl this time. She came into the world in a considerably shorter time than Henry had, as if she decided the process was straightforward and there was no reason to draw it out. They named her Cecilia Ann Sawyer, Cecilia because it was a name Esther had loved since childhood, and Ann for Eli's mother, who was still living in Texas and who wrote letters in a careful hand, and who had come out to Kansas once, in the summer of 1875, and stayed for 3 weeks and helped with Henry and declared the ranch fine and Esther finer, and gone home satisfied. Cecilia was, from her first weeks, an entirely different kind of person than her brother. Where Henry was watchful and deliberate, Cecilia was loud and present and certain of her centrality to any situation. She had Esther's coloring lighter, with the reddish quality to her hair that appeared sometimes in Esther's family, and she had opinions about everything by the time she could express them, which was early. Henry, for his part, adored his sister with the focused devotion of a child who had been an only child long enough to take that status for granted, and then had it upended by someone he immediately understood was going to change everything. He was 3 when she was born, and he treated her with a mixture of proprietary pride and genuine wonder that made Eli catch Esther's eye, sometimes over the children's heads, with a particular expression that she had come to love, the expression of a man who was sometimes quietly overwhelmed by the goodness of what he had. The school grew. By 1878, there were 23 children enrolled, and Millhaven had finally built a proper school building. A frame structure with 4 windows, a good wood stove, and enough desk space for 30 students on a plot of land donated by Harold Pierce of the general store, who had apparently decided at some point that improving the town was worth more than the price of a bottle of ink. Ruth Finch continued as Esther's teaching partner, and they worked together with the easy rhythm of 2 people who had found a professional partnership that suited them both. Garrett Pyle had finally, after years of similar disputes with other neighbors, overreached sufficiently that the county took action. A proper land survey of the whole district in 1876 had confirmed that Eli's boundaries were correct, and that Pyle had in fact been encroaching on several of his neighbors' land for years. The legal resolution had been slow and expensive, but it had been real, and Pyle had been required to return the disputed acreage to the families he'd taken it from, including the 12 acres the Alderman family had given up in exhaustion 3 years earlier. This was the moment when Esther understood that the frontier justice of this period was not always swift or clean or automatic, but that it sometimes, with enough persistence and clear documentation and the refusal to be worn down, arrived. She and Eli talked about it the evening they heard the final news, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the warm summer dark with the creek sounding below and Henry asleep inside and Cecilia asleep in her basket beside Esther's chair. "Mrs. Alderman must be glad," Eli said. "She wept," Esther said. "When I told her, she stood in the school doorway and wept. She said she'd stopped believing it would happen." Eli was quiet for a moment. "You should have seen her husband's face when he first heard about the land survey findings. He came into the smithy while I was there with Jonas, and Jonas told him. He just stood there very still for a long time, and then he said, 'Well, we'll see.'" He didn't let himself believe it either until the paperwork was done. "Can you blame them?" "No," he said. "People who have been hurt by a process are right to be careful about trusting it." She looked at him in the warm dark. "That's exactly right," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "I've been listening to you for 5 years. Some of it sticks." She smiled at that, the warm, particular smile she had for him, the one that was all the way in her eyes. He had long since stopped almost smiling at her. When he smiled now, it was the full thing, certain and warm, and it still changed his face the same way it always had. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry, and the cattle needed driving to better grass, and Eli was away for 3 weeks, which was the longest he had been away since they'd been married. Esther managed the ranch with Thomas, who was 28 now, and had become as much a part of the place as the creek or the barn. And she managed the school, and she managed Henry, who was 4.5 and deeply interested in everything, and Cecilia, who was 1.5 and already walking, and who had decided that no was a word that applied to other people. She was not afraid when Eli was away. She was occasionally lonely, which was different. She had built a life here with roots that were her own: the school, the friendships, the house, the children, and those things were solid under her feet even when he was gone. But she missed him with a specificity that still sometimes surprised her. The particular sound of his boots on the porch, the way he made coffee in the morning, the quality of the silence beside him that was different from the silence without him. He came back on a Tuesday evening at the end of the 3 weeks, riding the gray horse that was older now but still steady. And she saw him from the porch when he was still a half-mile out on the road, the particular shape of him on the horse, unmistakable even at distance. She did not run out to meet him because she was holding Cecilia, but she walked out to the gate and stood there. And when he rode up and swung down from the saddle, she put her free arm around him and held on for a moment, and he pressed his face against her hair and held her back. And Cecilia looked at her father with great seriousness and then said "duh" with considerable satisfaction and patted his hat brim. He laughed, the good, full laugh, and Esther thought, "There it is. There is the thing I would have missed if that wheel had held together." Henry came running from the barn where he'd been helping Thomas with the evening feeding, and Eli crouched down and opened his arms, and Henry ran straight into them. And Eli picked him up and stood there holding his son and his daughter, and looking at his wife in the evening light with an expression that was so unguarded and full that Esther had to look away for a moment at the wide, golden, darkening Kansas sky. The years kept coming, as years did. Millhaven grew. A second general store opened in 1880, which reduced Harold Pierce's monopoly on ink prices to Esther's quiet satisfaction. A proper doctor arrived, an actual physician, a young man named Dr. Augustus Reed, who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he was vague about, but which appeared to involve a broken engagement and a desire for distance. And he set up a small clinic that served the whole district. A Presbyterian minister arrived and established a congregation in the church, which had until then been conducting services under a rotating system of lay readers. Eli's ranch reached 150 head by 1881. He took on a 4th hand. He added a root cellar behind the house and a proper dairy room, because Esther had convinced him that 2 good milking cows would improve their household considerably, which they did. He was respected in the district now. People came to him with questions about land and cattle in the way they came to people who had been doing something successfully long enough that their judgment was trusted. He served on the county's land oversight committee for 2 years, which he found tedious but which he understood was important, and so he did it without complaining, except to Esther, who listened and then offered useful observations that he incorporated without acknowledgement in a way that she found secretly amusing. Henry started school in the fall of 1880 in his mother's classroom, which he appeared to regard as entirely natural and correct. He was a serious, curious student who read with the intensity of someone who understood very early that books were a particular kind of door, and he had his mother's tendency to form clear and directional opinions about things and his father's tendency to express them with economy. His teacher, his mother, pushed him harder than she pushed the other students, and he accepted this without complaint, apparently understanding the logic of it. The other children found it confusing at first and then stopped noticing. Cecilia was 3.5 when Henry started school, and she spent that autumn developing a series of opinions about being left at home during the school day that she expressed with great volume and creativity. Esther managed this by bringing her along on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the days Ruth took the primary lesson, and letting Cecilia participate in the younger children's activities, which Cecilia accepted as obviously appropriate. She was, from her earliest years, a person who assumed she belonged wherever she happened to be, which Esther recognized as a trait she intended to carefully support rather than suppress, having spent enough of her own early life not being certain she belonged anywhere. They had a third child in 1882. Another son, William Thomas Sawyer Thomas, for the ranch hand who had become part of the family in all but name, who wept when he heard the middle name and then pretended he had dust in his eye. William was born in March, a month earlier than expected, which made for a frightening few days during which everyone was very careful and very quiet, and held the small boy as if he were something precious and fragile, which he was. But he was strong, for all his early arrival, and by May he was clearly going to be fine. Esther, looking at 3 children, Henry, who was 7, and reading Dickens on his own, and asking questions about it. Cecilia, who was 4, and who had decided that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up because Dr. Reed had set a neighbor's broken arm in front of her, and she had watched with fascination rather than horror, and William, who was new and small, and already making his wants clearly known, felt a fullness that was sometimes almost too much to contain. She was 35 years old. She had come to Kansas in a broken wagon in the rain with nothing but books and her mother's lamp. She had a husband who loved her with the same steady, certain, unhurried attention he had given her since the first day on the road, who could make her laugh and who argued with her sometimes, and who listened to her always, and who held her in the dark after William's early birth when she was frightened, and didn't say it would all be fine but simply held her, which was the truer and more useful thing. She sat on the porch of the ranch house on a spring evening in 1882 with William asleep in her arms and Cecilia, sitting on the porch step drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, and Henry lying on his stomach in the grass 20 feet away with a book open in front of him. And Eli came around the side of the house from the barn and sat down in the rocking chair beside her and looked at the scene with the expression she knew meant he was feeling all of it, the whole of it. "Do you remember the rain?" she said. He glanced at her. He knew what she meant immediately. "I remember. I stood in a hollow in the grass and watched you for an hour," she said. "I didn't tell you for a long time." "I know," he said. "I always thought it was longer than you said." She looked at him. "What? I wondered where you'd gone. You were quiet for a long time." He leaned back in the rocking chair. "I figured you were nearby. I figured if I just kept doing what needed doing you'd come back." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew." "I thought so," he said. "I didn't know what you were thinking about." "You," she said simply. He looked out at Henry in the grass and Cecilia drawing in the dirt and the creek catching the last light below the pasture. "I know that now," he said. "Is that all you have to say about it?" He reached over and took her free hand, the one not holding William, and held it the way he always had, with complete certainty. "I'm glad you were watching," he said. "I'm glad you stayed long enough to decide." She leaned her head back against the chair and looked at the enormous Kansas sky, which was doing one of its extraordinary things with the color of the evening, and she held William against her chest and held Eli's hand, and listened to Cecilia singing something tuneless and confident to herself on the step, and Henry turning a page in the grass. And the creek ran below, and the cattle were in the far pasture, and the gray horse, Eli's gray horse, older now and slower but still present and dignified, stood at the fence in the last light. The whole of it, the whole, complete, improbable, particular whole of it. She thought about the girl she had been in Missouri, clear-headed and capable and thoroughly alone in the world, deciding to put everything she owned in a wagon and drive west toward something she couldn't yet name. She thought about the broken wagon wheel in the ditch, and the rain coming down in long gray sheets, and the stranger riding around the curve in the road on a big gray horse with no fuss and no drama, just a man who saw what needed doing and did it. She thought about standing in the hollow in the grass, watching him hold that wheel in the downpour, the water running off his hat in a curtain and his coat black with rain and his voice low and steady as he talked to her stubborn horse. No audience, no performance, just a man being exactly who he was when nobody was watching, except she had been watching. For a full hour she had been watching, and what she had seen had changed the direction of everything. "Eli," she said. "I never regretted it," she said. "Not one part of it." He squeezed her hand. Outside in the grass, Henry looked up from his book at the sky and then back at the page. Cecilia abandoned her dirt drawing and climbed up onto the porch and sat down heavily on Esther's feet with the unself-conscious gravity of a child who has chosen her location and is satisfied with it. William slept on against Esther's chest, his small warm weight absolute and trusting. The spring evening settled over the ranch and the pasture and the creek and the small, growing town 8 miles north, over the church that had been their school and their wedding hall, over the schoolhouse with its 4 windows and its good wood stove, over the rise above the road where they had stood in the first sunset of knowing, over the road itself with its long straight course through the flat gold land, over the place in the road, 4 miles from Millhaven, where a wagon wheel had once bounced into a ditch, and a man had ridden around a curve and dismounted without fuss and picked it up and carried it, and a woman had stood in a hollow in the grass and watched him for a full hour in the rain and made a decision she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. All of it, every mile, every Sunday, every difficult winter and golden summer, every child, every argument, every quiet evening, and every morning she woke up in the ranch house and heard him already moving in the kitchen making the coffee strong the way she liked it. All of it had been already present somehow in that hour in the rain. All of it had already been on its way. Esther Garner. Esther Sawyer now. Teacher, wife, mother, woman of the Kansas plain. She closed her eyes and listened to the evening, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.